What if what we call the past is not really behind us, but sleeping under our feet? What if, as we walk through the ancient streets of Europe, something very oldest is silent, waiting for the right moment to be remembered? There are questions that do not arise from curiosity, but from a strange, almost intimate sensation, as if the soul recognized an ancient echo before the mind even understood the reason. Since we were children, we learn an organized, linear, comfortable story. Peoples arise. They evolve, they build, they disappear. Everything seems to follow a logical, clean order, controllable. But sometimes, all it takes is one out-of-place detail for this narrative to begin, to tremble. A date that doesn't close. A structure that should not exist. A tunnel where no one imagined there was even room to breathe. Beneath Europe, there is more than soil and rock. There are layers. Layers of time, of silence, and perhaps deliberate forgetfulness. Underground cities. Underground networks. Monuments that challenge not only modern engineering but the very idea of who we were. None of this screams. None of this is necessary. It's all there still, like seeds waiting for the right season. If you feel like certain things are no coincidence, maybe this video is just the thing that you needed to hear. Because there is a subtle discomfort that arises when we realize that the official story may be just one version, not the whole truth, but the part that fit into the books. The rest were buried. Literally. Civilizations do not disappear just because of natural catastrophes. Sometimes they disappear because someone decided they shouldn't be remembered. And when that happens, the what remains are not answers, but traces. Marks in stone. Impossible alignments. Excavated corridors where there should be no reason to dig. Europe, seen from above, is a museum. It is memory. It is heritage. But seen from below, she is different thing. A hidden file. An ancient body that holds secrets in its bones. And how much the more science advances, the more evidence emerges that does not fit the accepted narrative. Evidence that does not ask for belief. Just courage to be observed without fear. Perhaps what scares the most is not the possibility of a wrong story, but the idea of that we were taught not to ask certain questions. Because questions open doors. And some doors, once opened, forever change the way we see who we are, and where we really come from. Before the Europe we know existed, there was another Europe, not defined by borders, tongues, or crowns, but through cycles, observations, and an intimate relationship with the land. Very before Rome, classical Greece, or medieval empires, people walked through these same plains carrying a knowledge that left no books, only deep marks in the soil and stone. Archaeologists call this period prehistory, as if it were a void, but not empty is synonymous with absence. It's just the absence of written records. And when we remove the written as an absolute criterion of intelligence, something uncomfortable emerges. Structures sophisticated, precise alignments and monumental interventions emerge in times where, theoretically, humans barely knew how to plant crops. Beneath modern agricultural fields, roads and tourist towns lie layers of settlements much older than previously recognized. Some were discovered by chance, during common excavations. Others remain hidden because they don't fit in. Accepted models. Dates are adjusted. Contexts are smoothed. The strange thing is turned into an exception. There are signs of organized societies that understood astronomical cycles, geological and climatic behavior, not as myths, but as practical tools for survival. The repetition of these patterns in different regions suggests an exchange of knowledge, not isolation. It suggests collective memory, not improvisation. What happens when we accept that these cultures may have been more advanced? Then what do we imagine? The entire evolutionary line needs to be reviewed, not like a simple ladder, but like waves. Advances followed by falls, constructions followed by erasures, each collapse taking with it entire libraries that were never written. Natural cataclysms, abrupt climate changes, and events that we now call legends may have been real experiences. For those who survived, preserve knowledge meant adapting it, turn it into a symbol, in ritual, in stone aligned to the sky. Because symbols survive when words are lost. Perhaps Europe was not born in the classical cradle that we learn about, but on ruins much older. Ruins that supported new cultures without ever being fully understood. And if that's true, then the question stops being who built it first, and it becomes, What exactly was forgotten and why? These old layers don't scream for attention. They whisper. This are present in artificial hills, in reused stones, in foundations that no one explains properly. A science is beginning to find them, but it doesn't always know what to name them. When there is no category, there is discomfort. And where there is discomfort, resistance arises. Accepting a Europe older means accepting that the past was not simple, nor linear, nor docile. Means admitting that we have been here before in other ways with other mental maps. Maybe not wiser, but certainly not ignorant. European soil keeps this memory as a compressed file. Each discovery is like unpacking a fragment. And fragments, when brought together, form an image that can no longer be ignored. And perhaps it is precisely this silent recognition that leads us to the next threshold, where the underground stops being just geology and starts to reveal intention, engineering, and hidden paths that connect a forgotten story to an even deeper one. That's where we began to descend together, step by step, without maps, just questions, and silence. Now, across Europe, there are structures that defy not only modern engineering, but the calendar itself that we have learned to respect. Stones that shouldn't be there, cuts that do not match known tools, monuments whose age seems pushing the story into uncomfortable territory, where certainties begin to crumble. When archaeologists come across these constructions, their first impulse is not to celebrate them, but contain them. Because dates are more than numbers. They are narrative pillars. If a structure is too old, it threatens everything built around it. Then alternative explanations emerge. Adjustments. Polite silences. The impossible is transformed into an anomaly. Some of these structures display colossal blocks fitted together with a precision that challenges even modern machines. Others show signs of vitrification, as if the stone had been exposed to extreme temperatures for unknown reasons. There is also underground foundations so deep that they seem to belong to a world before own current soil. The problem is not just how they were built, but when. Modern methods of dating, when applied, sometimes returns results that do not fit into no chronology accepted, ages that precede officially recognized cultures, dates that suggest human occupations organized into periods considered unlikely. And when it does, the discovery rarely makes headlines. There is a curious pattern. The older and more complex the structure, the less attention it receives outside specialized circles, as if excessive time were inconvenient, as if there was an invisible line that shouldn't be crossed. From there, the past becomes politically sensitive. These constructions do not appear to be improvised. They follow geometric patterns, astronomical orientations, and material choices that indicate planning. Nothing there suggests primitive trial and error. On the contrary, everything points to knowledge accumulated, transmitted, and applied with confidence. The inevitable question arises, who possessed this knowledge? If we accept that, such structures are older than we admit, so we need to accept that society's highly organized ones existed before those we know. And this breaks the idea of linear progress, introduces the possibility of losses, from falls, of new beginnings. Perhaps these forbidden dates are not errors but signs, hints of a longer story deep, where civilizations emerge, reach sophisticated levels, and disappear without leave-written records. Not because they didn't know how to write, but because time, water, and waterland were stronger. Every impossible stone is a silent question. Every date out of place is an invitation to discomfort. And the more we try to ignore them, the more they return, like echoes trapped in the rock. Because the past doesn't disappear, it accumulates, and at some point it requires be heard. Perhaps the real mystery is not how these structures were erected, but why we learn to look at them without actually seeing them. And that's exactly when we see that we notice something unsettling. Many of these constructions are not isolated. They are part of larger, connected, hidden systems, often below the surface. Surface. That's where the story starts to go downhill. Beneath the European surface lies a world that rarely appears on maps. One world excavated not by chance but by intention. Tunnels that cross kilometers. Cameras hidden beneath castles, churches, and modern cities. Passages that don't just lead from one point to another, but from one era to another, as if the soil had been used to preserve something of time. For centuries, these structures were treated as local curiosities, old cellars, improvised refugees, regional legends. But when analyzed together, they reveal a disturbing pattern. Many of these passages follow consistent directions, keep similar heights. They present repeated digging techniques. They don't look like works isolated, but parts of much larger systems. In several parts of Central and Eastern Europe, underground, cities appear where no one expected. Some are deep enough to house thousands of people. They have ventilation, water reservoirs in common areas. This is not improvisation. It is planning, and planning presupposes threat, purpose, or both. What is intriguing is not only the existence of these spaces but their uncertain antiquity. In many cases, there are no written records about its construction. They were simply there when they were rediscovered, as if they had been inherited by later cultures who just reused them, without fully understanding their origin. There are tunnels that connect distant hills, passing under rivers and unstable terrain. There are passages so old that they were intentionally sealed, not by collapse, but by human decision. Stone doors, camouflaged entrances, architectural silence. Who builds something like this doesn't plan on being found easily. The official narrative usually says that these spaces were only used for defense, hides in times of war, but this explanation begins to fail when we realize that many of them predate the known conflicts. Others are far away of strategic borders, and some required such monumental effort that they didn't justify it only by fear. Maybe the underground was more than just a refuge. Maybe it was memory, a place where knowledge, people, or objects could go through periods of instability. One buried archive, protected from fire, looting, and oblivion. In this sense, the earth, it would not be an obstacle, but protection. When we look at these networks as a whole, an uncomfortable question arises. And if were these structures part of a world parallel to the surface? One world silent, functional, ready to last, not for days or years, but for generations. It requires a vision of the future that we rarely attribute to the ancients. Going down these tunnels is like crossing an invisible border. The air changes, the sound changes, a perception changes. It's as if time slows down, maybe because down there, time actually been treated differently. And the further we go down, the harder it gets to support the idea that all this was done without a deep knowledge of space, matter, and of the human being himself. And it is precisely this complexity that leads us to the next point. Because above these tunnels on the surface there are marks that dialogue with them. Standing stones, aligned to the sky, as if what was below was also connected to what was above. And when we realize this, we understand that nothing was built alone. On the surface, above the tunnels and hidden cities, stones rise that seem to observe the sky for millennia. Megaliths spread throughout Europe, positioned with the intention that goes far beyond aesthetics or simple ritual. They were not placed at chance. They have been aligned, measured, and adjusted with a precision that suggests deep understanding of celestial cycles. For a long time, these structures were called primitive, rustic altars, tribal monuments. But when analyzed with modern instruments, they reveal something disconcerting. Many of these megaliths are aligned with solstices, equinoxes, and rare astronomical events. Some mark eclipses. Others follow lunar cycles too long to be perceived in a single lifetime. This type of knowledge requires continuous observation for generations, requires records, demands method, and above all, it requires intention to transmit information across time. Stone. In this context, it is not a symbol, it's language. A language that survives when parchments rot and libraries burn. The most disturbing thing is that these alignments appear in regions far from each other, separated by mountains, seas, and officially unconnected cultures. Still, follow similar patterns, recurring angles, repeated proportions. One silent mathematics that suggests common origin, or at the very least, exchange of knowledge in large scale. Some of these sites reveal something even stranger. The position of the stones does not corresponds to the current sky, but to the sky of thousands of years ago, as if they had been built to mark a specific time, a fixed point in cosmic history, one reminder recorded in space when something important happened, or would happen. The official story tends to attribute this to coincidence or ritual obsession, but coincidences they lose strength when they are repeated with such consistency. And rituals don't explain the mathematical precision involved. They do not explain why errors are minimal, not even why corrections appear to have been made over the centuries. Perhaps these monuments functioned as a map as temporal, guides for people who would come later, an orientation system that is not just spatial, but existential. Look at the heaven was understanding one's position in the universe, and aligning the earth with the sky was a way of keep this bond alive, even after breakdowns and forgetfulness. What we today call mythology may once have been applied science, one science, integrated with spirituality, where observing the stars was also observing yourself same, where the movement of the stars reflected humanity's internal cycles. These stones remain. They don't speak. They don't explain. They just point. And the more we learn to read them, but we realize that they were not isolated. They were part of a larger system, connected to what was below the earth and above the sky. A knowledge complete, fragmented by time. And when we realize this, an inevitable question arises. If this knowledge existed, if it was so broad and precise, why did he disappear? Or perhaps the correct question is something else. He really disappeared. Or was it just silenced? There are times when what most reveals a truth is not what was said, but what was never mentioned. Official history is constructed both by records and by absences. And when we look closely at the European past, we notice gaps too big to be accidental, smoothed entire periods, abrupt transitions, explained in a few lines, silences that echo louder than words. Whenever a discovery threatens to rearrange the timeline, something curious happens. The debate closes. The financing disappears. The research is classified as inconclusive. This is not necessarily a conscious conspiracy, but an ancient mechanism of self-protection. Paradigms endure because they sustain careers, institutions, and collective identities. The history we learn was shaped to be stable, linear, comfortable. She starts at specific points and ignores everything that comes before as if it were chaos. But the past reality is rarely organized this way. It is fragmented, repetitive, and often inconvenient. Accepting this requires humility, and humility is not always welcome in power structures. Over the centuries, archives have been burned, libraries destroyed, and oral traditions destroyed, devalued. What survived was filtered, copied, rewritten, not with the intention explicit of lying, but of organizing the world according to dominant values. The result is an elegant but incomplete narrative. When ancient sites are discovered in unexpected contexts, they are often reinterpreted to fit the existing model. If they are too complex, they are assigned to later cultures. If they are too old, their dates are questioned. The problem is not his scientific caution, but the systematic refusal to allow data to change history, rather than history shaping the data. This silence is not empty. He is active. He directs the gaze. Teach what should be considered important and what can be ignored. And over time, what is ignored if makes it invisible. Generations grow up without even knowing what questions they could ask. Perhaps this is why certain discoveries only gain attention when they are impossible to deny. When satellite imagery, underground scans, or independent analysis force a re-evaluation. Even so, change is slow, resistant, almost painful. There is something deeply human about this process. The fear of losing references. The fear that by admitting a more complex past we lose control over the present. Because if we were already more advanced and fell, then progress is not guaranteed. He is fragile, reversible. The silence of official history is not just about what has been forgotten, but about what is still can be remembered. Every gap is a closed door. Every closed door, a choice. And every choice reveals a priority. Perhaps the most important moment is not when new evidence emerges, but when we are ready to listen to them without trying to silence them. Because what was erased, it never disappears completely. It remains on the sidelines waiting, and when finally returns, does not ask for permission. It just requires us to be honest with what we see. Science advances precisely when something doesn't fit. When a given insists on contrary to expectation, it becomes a crack in the model. And under Europe, these cracks are multiplying. New technologies have begun to see what previously it was invisible, and what appears does not always confirm what we thought we knew. Soil scans, deep penetrating radar, and geophysical analyses reveal structures beneath entire cities, symmetrical cavities, hallways lined up, voids where there should be nothing but compact rock. In many cases, these findings are not widely publicized. They are restricted to technical reports, far from public debate. There is also the problem of dates. Samples, organics associated with ancient structures' unexpected ages sometimes return, not a little older but drastically out of the accepted period. When this happens, the first reaction is to suspect the method, contamination, statistical error, misinterpreted context. All of this is possible. But when similar results are repeated in different locations, the exception begins to occur. Appear standard. Genetic research adds another layer to the mystery. Population studies indicate complex human movements, comings and goings that do not match simple narratives of migration. There are signs of ancient mixtures, abrupt disappearances and reappearances, genetic data that suggest large-scale population collapses and recompositions. Geology also tells an unsettling story. Layers of sediment point to fast, not slow, catastrophic events. Massive floods. Climate change abrupt. Periods of intense cold followed by sudden warming. For civilizations dependent on stable cycles, this would mean almost total destruction. For whom survived, would mean radical adaptation. Discomfort arises when we connect this data. Advanced structures appear sooner than they should. Populations disappear suddenly. The weather changes shape violent. And yet, certain traditions, symbols, and knowledge reappear more often than not. Late, like distant echoes. Something was lost. Something has been preserved. But we don't know exactly how. Traditional science prefers isolated answers. Each discipline analyzes its part. But this puzzle requires an integrated vision. Archaeology, genetics, geology, and astronomy seem to point to a much more unstable past than we like to admit. One past where civilizations may have arisen, prospered, and been nearly erased repeatedly times. The problem is not a lack of evidence, but an excess of complexity. Accept these conclusions requires abandoning the idea of continuous progress. It requires accepting that the human knowledge does not grow in a straight line. It wavers, advance, fall, return transformed. Perhaps we are just at the beginning of a profound shift in perspective. One moment in which science begins to touch limits imposed not by the lack of data, but by the resistance to reinterpreting them. Because when the evidence doesn't add up, we have two choices: force them to fit, or redesign the entire picture. And it is precisely when the picture begins to change that we realize something even more deep. Much of this scientific evidence echoes ancient stories, myths, legends, symbolic narratives that speak of falls, floods, and restarts. Perhaps far from being fantasies, they are coded memories, and understanding this requires listening to the past, no only with instruments, but with disciplined imagination. For a long time, European mythology was treated as fantasy. Beautiful stories, but childish. Gods, giants, floods, and subterranean worlds were placed in shelf of the collective imagination, far from serious history. But when we look at these narratives carefully, something unexpected happens. They begin to align with archaeological discoveries, real climate events, and patterns that cross continents. Myths rarely appear out of nowhere. They are shaped by intense, repeated, and shared. Catastrophes leave deep marks on collective memory. When the technical language does not exist, experience becomes a symbol. The event becomes a narrative. The trauma becomes a legend. And so, what could not be recorded in numbers was preserved in stories. In several European traditions, there are reports of previous eras destroyed by water, fire, or ice. There is talk of ages of the world that ended abruptly, people who disappeared, lost knowledge, underground refuges where some survived while the surface was devastated. These stories appear in mythology, Norse, Celtic, Greek, and even lesser-known popular traditions. The curious thing is that these narratives share common elements: a huge collapse, one small group of survivors, the reconstruction of the world, and often the transmission of ancient knowledge to subsequent generations, often through figures considered semi-divine, not as distant masters, but as guardians of memory. When we cross these stories with modern scientific data, the discomfort increases. We know today that the end of the last ice age was marked by extreme events, thaws fast, abrupt rise in sea level, entire regions were submerged, coastal communities disappeared. This is not a myth, it's geology. For those who lived through these events, the world literally ended. And when the world ends, the language changes. What was everyday became sacred. What was technical became symbolic. So myth can be seen not as invention, but as compression of information, one emotional and historical archive transmitted through time. Maybe the ancient gods represent leaders, sages, or groups bearing knowledge inherited from a previous era. Perhaps monsters symbolize natural forces misunderstood. Perhaps the underground worlds are not just metaphors but distorted memories of real refugees. To ignore these narratives is to miss an essential layer of human history. They replace science, but they dialogue with it. They function as clues, evidence left by who had no other way of recording what they experienced. When mythology is discarded, we lose context. When observed rigorously and respect, it turns into a map, an imperfect, symbolic, but incredibly persistent, because stories survive where stones fall and cities sink. Perhaps Europe has not just buried ruins but memories encoded in its legends. And perhaps the biggest mistake was believing that, because they were old, these stories they had nothing to say to us, when in reality, they were trying to remind us of something we are still beginning to understand. If we accept that advanced civilizations may have existed before those we know of, an inevitable question arises: what happened to them? The most plausible answer is no, is in epic wars or mysterious invasions, but in something much more indifferent and powerful. The Earth itself. The planet is not stable. It pulsates, oscillates, and, in certain moments, transforms brutally. Geological records show that the past was marked by sudden events. No slow, gradual changes, but quick shocks. Cosmic impacts. Volcanic activity intense. Accelerated thaws. In a matter of decades, sometimes years, entire landscapes have been redesigned. For societies dependent on predictability, this meant almost immediate collapse. Imagine coastal cities swallowed by the sea, fertile plains transformed into deserts, trade routes destroyed, knowledge concentrated in centers that simply ceased to exist. When this happens, there is no time to preserve everything. Just fragments survive. And those who survive are not those who have the most knowledge, but those who are in the right place, in the right way. These survivors carry something precious: memory, not complete, not organized, but enough to rebuild. And when rebuilding, they adapt, simplify, translate that remind us of new realities. Inherited knowledge is no longer the same. He is shadow of what was, but still, it's heritage. Perhaps this is why we see advances emerging abruptly in certain historical periods. Unexpected leaps in agriculture, architecture, or astronomy. Not like inventions from scratch, but as rediscoveries. Like someone vaguely remembering something learned long ago time, in another world. The official story calls this coincidence or individual genius, but maybe it is interrupted continuity. A thread that was never fully cut, just buried beneath layers of oblivion. Each restart carries traces of the previous cycle, even if we don't know how to recognize them. The problem is that incomplete inheritances also carry risks. When the context loses, the meaning is distorted. Techniques become rituals. Scientific observations turn into myths. Survival tools become sacred symbols. And, over time, the origin dissolves. This does not diminish the value of these later cultures. On the contrary, show your ability of adaptation. But it also reveals a fragility. Without fully understanding what inherited, they rebuilt on bases they did not know. And this may explain why certain knowledge appears and disappears repeatedly throughout history. Perhaps Europe has been the scene of more than one great reset. Each one almost erased all of the above, but never completely. There are always ruins left. Alignments. Stories. Fragments scattered like pieces of a puzzle that no one else remember how to assemble. And if this is true, then we are not at the peak of continuous progress, but at more a cycle, a moment between remembering and forgetting. The question that remains is not whether we have fallen before, but whether we will learn anything from these echoes of the past. Because inheritances lost do not disappear. They return, in one form or another, demanding that they be recognized. When a civilization collapses, knowledge does not disappear uniformly. He fragments. Some parts are lost forever. Others survive in the hands of few. The central question, then, is not just what was lost, but who remained with the remaining fragments. Because someone always remains. Throughout European history, we see the emergence of groups that seem to hold knowledge, ancient with no clear explanation of origin. Priests, builders, initiatory orders, isolated communities. People who knew where to build, when to plant, how to align, how to preserve. Not as an improvisation, but as a silent tradition. And these heirs rarely presented themselves as inventors. On the contrary, they said just keeping something old, something received, something that needed to be protected from use indiscriminate. And when knowledge is treated as something too dangerous or too sacred, he naturally becomes reserved. Perhaps this is why certain advances appear first in religious or religious contexts. Symbolic. Monasteries that dominated astronomy. Orders that preserved geometry complex. Builders who knew how to work stone in ways that seemed to go beyond common technique of his time. Not because they were magicians, but because they inherited methods. The transmission did not need to be complete. It just needed to be functional. A principle here, a pattern there, an empirical rule that worked even without theoretical explanation. With the time, the why was lost, but the how remained. And that's enough to rebuild, partially a world. There is also the factor of isolation. Remote communities protected by geography or choice tend to preserve traditions for longer. In caves, remote valleys, islands, and mountainous regions, certain knowledge may have passed through centuries almost intact, far from major political collapses. This would explain why similar techniques emerge at different historical moments, without a clear line of development, as if they were awakened, reactivated, no created from scratch. Someone remembered, someone taught, even without knowing where it came from originally came. History often celebrates ruptures, renaissances, revolutions, but maybe what we call rebirth is just the moment when ancient knowledge returns on the surface, adapted to a new language, an echo that finds ready ears. If this is true, then modern Europe was built not just on ruins physical, but about invisible inheritances, knowledge transmitted outside of official books, stored in practices, symbols, and architectures, not as a conspiracy, but as cultural survival. The question that remains is unsettling. These heirs knew the real origin of what carried, or were they also just links in a much longer chain, repeating gestures whose deep meaning had already been lost? Maybe some knew. Maybe others just felt that it was too important to abandon. And if today there are still fragments of this knowledge, dispersed, incomplete, but real, then the past is not closed. It continues to flow through us. The question is not who inherited before, but who is inheriting now, even without perceive. Even after everything that has been discovered, most of Europe's past remains invisible. Not because it doesn't exist, but because it remains buried, sealed, or simply ignored. It is estimated that only a minimal fraction of European soil has been excavated in a deep and systematic way. The rest remains untouched, protected through modern cities, agricultural areas, and the very difficulty of investigating without destroying. Recent technologies have begun to reveal how much is still hidden. Aerial sensors, satellite images, and underground mapping show geometric patterns beneath forests, fields, and urban centers. Straight lines where they shouldn't exist. Angles accurate under apparently natural terrain. Clear signs of human intervention in scales that defy simple explanations. The most intriguing thing is that many of these findings are not new. They were there all the time. What has changed is our ability to see without digging. And the more we see, the more we realize that the European underground is not a random chaos, but a palimpsest. Layers of occupation, abandonment, and reuse overlapping throughout millennia. There are places where modern foundations rest directly on much larger structures. Old, without anyone knowing exactly what is beneath. Churches built on previous temples. Castles built on artificial hills. Entire cities laid on underground networks whose original purpose has been lost. Each new construction covers the previous one, not out of intention to hide, but out of unconscious continuity. The problem is that each layer also makes access to the previous one difficult. Digging costs time, money, and involves risks. And when what can be found threatens to rewrite consolidated narratives, the incentive decreases even more. So the unknown remains comfortable while it is not confirmed. But the buried is not passive. He presses. Sometimes, it emerges by accident. A work of infrastructure reveals an unexpected tunnel. A drought exposes scars on the ground that are only visible from the air. A slide reveals ancient walls where there should be nothing. The past insists on speaking out, and perhaps this happens because there is still something important to remember. No necessarily a lost technology or an extraordinary secret, but a lesson about cycles, only fragility, about the false sense of permanence. Civilizations, previous generations may have believed their worlds were stable until they weren't. What is buried beneath our feet is not just stone. It's a warning, its memory compressed. A silent record that human complexity does not guarantee continuity. That knowledge can be lost as easily as it can be acquired. Perhaps the reason so many structures remain hidden is not just technical, but symbolic. Unearthing the past requires facing the possibility that we are not the point highest in history. Just one more chapter. A chapter that can also be closed. As we advance technologically, we gain tools to see deeper. The question is whether we will have the maturity to accept what we see, because when the soil begins to reveal his secrets, he does not deliver ready-made answers. He delivers questions, and some of them forever change the way we look at the future. And it is precisely in the face of these questions that we reach the limit of this journey. One point where it is not enough to investigate. It is necessary to silence, breathe, and allow what was forgotten. Watch us back, as if asking if we are ready to remember. Perhaps the biggest mistake when looking at the past is treating it as something closed. How if everything had already been experienced, explained, and archived? But the past doesn't sleep. He just changes language. Sometimes he talks about stone, sometimes in silence, sometimes in a sudden discomfort that arises when we realize that something doesn't fit. Throughout this journey, we do not seek to replace certainties with new beliefs. We seek space. Space to admit that human history can be deeper, more fragile, and more cyclical than we learned. That advances are not guarantees. What civilizations they flourish, and they also fall, taking with them entire worlds of meaning. Perhaps beneath Europe, there is not a single spectacular secret waiting to be revealed. Perhaps the real secret is repetition, the default, the realization that we have already been here before, full of confidence, technique, and vision, believing that what we build it would last forever. Soil teaches us something we rarely accept. Nothing is permanent, nor empires, neither knowledge, no identity. Everything that is not cared for, listened to, and understood deeply, it is lost, sometimes slowly, sometimes abruptly. But if something is lost, something also passes through. Fragmented memories, intuitions, symbols, echoes that resist time because they were inscribed in places where time passes differently. The earth guards, the sky marks, and the human being even without realizing it. Remember, if something inside you is awakening, stay until the end. The answer may be here, not as an external revelation, but as a silent change in the way of looking at the world. Because when we understand that we are not the beginning of history, we realize that we are responsible for how it continues. Perhaps the real invitation is not to dig up everything, but to learn to walk. More awareness of what sustains us. Honor the past not as nostalgia but as a warning, like a mirror, like a silent teacher. What we do now, with the knowledge we have, matters more than any ancient mystery. Because one day, someone might look at the traces we leave and try to understand who we were. And the question will not be how advanced we were, but how we were aware. If this message touched something for you, subscribe and follow us. Your soul may be remembering the path. What if what we call the end is just the beginning of a memory that humanity has not yet allowed itself to recover?